Good afternoon, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf.
And Ros from Scully's Handling About the Books.
And we're here to discuss our monthly reading of a modern, up-to-date work of fiction. So introduce the book for us.
I will. And just to say, we've fallen slightly behind for good reasons, but which you you might hear a few little squeakles.
Yes, some noises may occur.
Okay, so we read Nightbloom by Peace Adzo Medie, and that came out in 2023. She's a Ghanaian writer. She was actually born in Liberia and displaced by the Liberian War as a young child, but grew up in Ghana. And it's her second novel. Her first one, His Only Wife, was really well received, and this one was, it's been very well thought of, well reviewed, longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2024. So that's how we came to choose it.
Yeah. And it does, on paper, absolutely sound like the kind of book that we would both love, because it's got really interesting themes of sort of womanhood, domestic violence, the friendship, female friendship, experiences of growing up, and migration. It's got all sorts. So I really was expecting to love this book.
Yeah, and Medie herself, she as well as being an author of fiction, as she said, it's her second novel. She's also an academic, and she writes on, gender politics and domestic abuse affecting women, and so absolutely, I was sort of set up to think this is going to be an absolute Ros and Tilly sort of book. But was it? Is the question.
So although I found parts of this book interesting and engaging, my overall experience of this book was not very positive. I didn't really enjoy the reading experience of this book, and I'm sad to say that, because I wanted to, and I tried to. I think at the moment I've got quite a high requirement for engagement in the books that I'm reading, because I'm often reading them at very odd times in the middle of the night or so on. And this book didn't have the pace or the energy to sort of keep me going at times like that. And it's also, there's no getting away from the fact that at times it's quite a bleak story, and that is obviously important and vital to the book itself. But I was quite depressed and upset a lot of the time when I was reading this book, and the time around reading it as well. And I don't know whether I was I was a bit down and that made me more down about the book, or whether the book sort of dragged down my general mood. I feel like it might have been the book dragging down my general mood, but I don't know.
Yes, and I think I didn't enjoy the book as much as I expected to. I think I was a little bit more sort of positive about it than you, because I wasn't sort of having the challenges around reading that you were having, but I could absolutely understand why you felt like that. I think what she sets out to do in this book is she takes two friends, they're cousins, they spend quite a bit of time together in their childhood, that they have quite a close sort of bond. And then their lives kind of diverge. Mm-hmm. And what she wants us to see is how two people's experience of a relationship, of a childhood, youth, of their sort of lives that are lived almost in parallel, how that can be just honestly completely different, their experience, without either of them kind of deluding themselves or lying, that it can be genuinely completely different experience, how they live it, how they feel about it,
of communicating your own experience to somebody else. They're both sort of offended by the way the other one treats them at various points, without sort of being able to sort of really talk to each other and understand why that breakdown is occurring.
Yeah. And how she sets out to do that is she basically gives you the whole story from one young woman's perspective, and then the whole story from the other child and young woman's perspective. And I think that for me was possibly the problem, because all that first half of the book where we were with Akufar, like I found quite, yes, depressing, and sort of I don't need to love a character to enjoy a book, but she was quite rebarbative all the way, wasn't she? It was like, oh, why are you thinking that? Oh, you're so self-centered, just, and
that's the point of her character.
Way.
Yeah, she's supposed to be a young woman who's been born into one of Ghana's more privileged families, she's never, well, even up until the end of the book, I don't think she ever really sort of checks her privilege, to use the phrase. Like she always kind of assumes that everyone's life is similar to hers, I suppose, and doesn't really see the huge gulf between her life and her cousin's life. And her cousin is still, living in a relatively well-to-do family, I would say, particularly at the start. But yeah, the huge gulf in their experiences in things like access to education and life opportunities. Akofa's family are planning for her to go to university in America, and that's always something that she assumes is going to happen and be available for her, and she doesn't really appreciate the difference for Selassie compared to that.
Yeah. So when we got to the second half of the book and we got Selassie's story, that's when the book really took off more for me, because then I was like rethinking the whole first half of the book and every event, seeing, oh, now I can see the other side of it, and so on. And that was really, that was rich, and that was interesting, and sort of challenging in a nice way. But I'm not, if we hadn't been buddy reading this, I wonder if I actually would have given up before I got to that second half. I would
say we both started this book, and then I said, I can't keep reading this right now. So it had a couple of weeks of break, but that was because there was other stuff going on. So I do think if we hadn't have agreed to read it together, I think I would have read that first bit and maybe stopped. And that's a real shame, because there's bits towards the end of the book. For me, not even Selassie's story was definitely the better half, but it was only really the last chunk, particularly moving into the more sort of present day stuff, where I felt actually really gripped and like that I had some kind of buy-in to what was going to happen to the characters. I cared what the outcomes were going to be, and I think that's because a lot of the early part, there's a lot of things that are quite quotidian, where they're talking about little things that happen at school, and the point is that it's all trivial incidents that happen in their lives that get sort of blown out of proportion, but at the same time it did feel, like reading a lot of trivial things. But yeah, maybe I'm being a bit harsh, but that's how it felt to me.
I mean, because like where perhaps you're being a tiny bit harsh, and not, I don't actually disagree with you altogether, but like what she does is she gives you the most tremendous setting, doesn't she? I feel I like this like strata of Ghanaian society that I understand better, like expectations on women,
family
girls, so much that I kind of was absorbing from this book almost without knowing it, that I really appreciated a lot.
That was definitely one of the upsides for me, the way that she was able to make that setting quite real, and the normality of that setting as well, as in I was saying, things were trivial, but actually bringing out the little things like what people were eating for their meals and things that helped to add the life to the setting.
And how people speak to each other and treat each other in families, and the sort of was really interesting. I mean, like I enjoy a book that gives me a different cultural understanding, I suppose, and I thought I did get that from this book. I do wonder if it could have been structured a little differently somehow, to just help I don't know, do you know what I mean?
I would say for me, I really like having a little hint of what's to come. I think it would have worked better for me if our first chapter had been from the modern day setting and then gone back into their childhood, so we get the idea of this is where we're heading, and this is, you know, some quite intense things do happen. A little kind of heads up,
a teaser
yeah. So then we end up thinking,
carry
oh, how
you through,
do we end up with this situation emerging?
Yes, and then everything else that I'd have wanted to get there. And there's something that happens towards the end of the book that is a kind of a very dramatic incident, which we won't talk about because it would be a spoiler. But I think you could quite easily have put that at the beginning of the book,
and have the reader saying, why does this happen?
Why is this? And that would have really then all the way through I'd been reading it, the quotidian stuff I'd have been reading with a different light. And looking for clues.
That's just about choices on style and structure. I think
it is.
Oddly for me, when I was reading this, because I hadn't read so much about the author beforehand, when I was reading this for the first sort of third, I kind of had the feeling that it was a first book, and then I looked her up and I realized that it was a second book, and I was almost slightly surprised, because what I felt was that this is a really promising first book from an author that's gonna get better. But I don't know, maybe her first book is different.
That patronizing reader there. but I know what you mean.
But it's something that you've said many times before as well. We all say like, this is an interesting first book, I'd like to see what they do next. But I feel like that kind of decision about structure is something that you might take differently
with experience.
But I don't know, obviously I've not read her first book, so
no. Well, I'm actually quite curious to read her first book, and I may well do that.
And then it'll be interesting to hear how you feel the two compare together.
Because in a way, if she had in her head that she wanted to use this quite brave structure, the fact that she'd published one successful book may have enabled her to insist on that quite brave structure.
That's true.
And I can honor that whilst saying it didn't work perhaps brilliantly.
And I feel like this is one of the books that if I'd read it at a different time, I might have felt very differently about it. And that's true with any book often. But I think this one might have suffered from the mood that I was in as I was reading.
And in fact, I think she does actually write really, really well. And I think there's a kind of a veracity in the book, about how irritating, people can be, or how, their lack of self-awareness, or like when I was in America, she comes up against racism. And her reaction to that is really interesting, and really, because it's, she's really taken aback because she's sort of from a privileged background in Ghana, and suddenly she's like, being othered she's used to being othered as a woman, and now she's being othered because she's black.
And it's interesting to see how her experiences of racism at university are very different from her. Some people in her friendship group who've lived in America for longer, or had a different introduction to that experience of discrimination. So and I think that part in the university where incidents of discrimination, sort of the escalation that we see, I think that's actually a very good capsule for reflecting on her relationship with Selassie, and the way that it goes from a very minor misunderstanding, and it just ramps up very, very quickly into quite a threatening and scary situation that you can see that everyone involved is very unhappy about, and neither side thinks that they're doing anything wrong, and there's a definite issue with bias in the system of anyway, you can see how that feeds into the misunderstandings that she's had with Selassie. So that I felt was quite well crafted.
So as character studies, actually, they're really good, aren't they?
Yeah.
The two main characters.
The simple fact of, like, you know, she's a selfish character, that doesn't change. She has personal growth, but her sort of innate personality is consistent. Even down to, like, the decisions she takes sort of right at the end that are about kind of that are very understandable in the context of what she's experienced in her life, but they're also about sort of self-protection and protecting her family rather than
So there was lots to admire about this book. It just wasn't as enjoyable a read as I was expecting, and you know, but I'm still happy to have read it, I guess, is the answer. And probably it was slightly less painful for me than for sleep deprived Tilly.
Yes, and I'm sorry, because I always like to be able to say lots of positive things about it, but I also want to be honest about how I
but it's not, I wouldn't like disrecommend it, you know. It's just I think almost if I'd come to it knowing a little more about it, I might have actually enjoyed it more. I wouldn't
recommend it to everyone automatically, but I would recommend it to somebody who's looking for a book on those topics, or on it, like from that area, or that has an existing sort of interest and desire to read on those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So so there we go. And should we say what our next book is?
Yes. Please, you go ahead, because I've actually forgotten.
Love it. But is this what's called baby brain?
Possibly.
We said that we would read, because it's going to be December, that we'd read something that was like fun, and you know, a little bit more, and also having read what was quite a depressing book, as you say, something a bit more sort of light-hearted and hopeful. So we are reading The House on the Cerulean Sea.
Oh yes, of course we are. Brilliant. Yes.
So it's kind of fantasy, found family, queer, YA-ish, but one that very much appeals to adults as well, and has come highly recommended.
And I've heard fantastic things about this book for like since it came out. So I've been
and I think it came out in maybe 2020 or 21, but it's timely to read it because the sequel is either just out or just about to come out. So it feels like now's the moment, as we haven't read it, to read this, and then we may want to read the sequel.
Okay.
So tell us about, if you've read Nightbloom, give us dissenting opinions, you know. Tell us
argue back if you want to.
Argue back.
And if you've read her first book, you know, tell us what you thought of that as well. And any thoughts on House of the Cerulean Sea that we can bear in mind for our reading of next month as well.
And happy December reading, everybody.
Take care.